Hi, I'm Gianluca Fiorelli and welcome back to the third session. Today we are going to have an SEO and analytics consultant as a guest. He's from the UK in England, and even if he's an independent SEO and analytics consultant based in Cheltenham, okay, he worked for many years in a big agency, Equimedia. So he's going to be an interesting guest for asking also about how it is work in a big agency and how it can be the transition to consultancy, which is more common than we may think. Our guest is the one and
Jonathan.
only Jonathan Moore. Hey, Jonathan, how are you doing?
Hey, Gianluca. Thanks for having me on the show. Pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure for me to have you. And let's break the ice immediately. So, with a classic question, how SEO is treating you lately?
Yeah, I think SEO is treating me well. I'm still earning a living. I'm still enjoying it. No 2 days are the same, which is what I love about the job. And I get to solve problems. Couldn't be happier. It's the same, but always changing, right? So I
Yes.
think that's the main thing I love about the job is just it's constant change, always learning, and you're always learning something new every day.
Yes, it's surely never stopping its change is, let's call it evolution. And talking about evolution, just a curiosity, because sometimes one thing that always changes is how SEO define themselves, especially when to the public, not between themselves. You're still defining yourself as an SEO and data analyst consultant, or already started to use one of the many? Sometimes I've started to see qualification or self-naming for SEO, which are ones where I'm an SEO, but it started to be something like this, but with wide, because adding all the new things coming out.
Yeah, I think I'm still holding on, right? I'm still going on by SEO analytics consultant, but I must admit, I do vary it up a bit. I think even yesterday I introduced myself to someone who I wasn't too sure if they kind of knew what SEO was. So I just said, I work in technical marketing. So I do try to adapt it. It's pretty fluid, but I think for like professional purposes where I know like there's maybe other SEOs, I try to keep it like this succinct. I'm the SEO analytics consultant. So that's what I do. But essentially, I solve problems. I'm a consultant.
Oh,
I do two things.
like
I solve,
like the guy in Pulp Fiction, I solve problems.
yeah, like
Remember?
well, I do two things. I solve problems. I build capabilities for my clients within that sort of SEO analytics, data umbrella. But if you break it down, that's what I try to do for people.
Yeah, that's the most important thing. And I was saying, you worked for many years, more than a decade, if I remember well, in Equimedia. I know it may sound stupid what I'm saying, but when I'm thinking about international SEO, for instance, it's for me more common to know people doing international SEO who are not from the UK and even less from the US. For some reason, I don't know, maybe because it's Spanish people or Italians are using a language that, okay, it can be popular, etc., but it's not the common tongue for all the world when it comes, for instance, for commerce, for communication, etc., like English. So for these reasons, I was not so used to know people who really are strong and have a strong knowledge of international SEO from the UK and the US. You are one of these exceptions, if I'm not wrong, because you always have dealt with companies and with clients with a global experience. So going straight to the big question, which is also popping up quite frequently in recent posts, also from me, Motoko and others. How are you seeing the LLMs, AI models, treating businesses with a multi-country or a multilingual presence? Do you see some kind of disruption as people like me or Motoko and are seeing?
Yeah, I think there's like if we break it down, is there's like a clear underlying bias, right, behind a lot of these systems, right? Because with English being like the I think it's like the lingua franca worldwide, right? Everything underlying has been trained on English. That could be, and English is on its own like quite a broad church, right? So you've got UK English, US English, Canadian, Australian, so on and so forth. And then like, maybe like the English that they speak in like a place like in India, right? Where it's official language. So even at that level, it's quite challenging, right? To understand like the underlying bias or actually like who the models have been trained on, right? And what their perception of the world is. So I think from that underlying core principle, that then percolates in many different ways, right? One of my favorite phrases is like the stochastic parrot, right? The LLM just parrot back stuff to us. And I think it's bad enough maybe in English, right? You get, as a Brit, you get frustrated with the difference between UK and US cultural differences, even though they're very subtle. As someone that's Welsh, I might get annoyed with like English stuff. So it's very, you can go up, you can go down in terms of like the sort of the subtleties there. But sort of tying it back to like a more, say, non-English speakers, I think there's some real challenges there in terms of like how it interprets that. Because essentially it's, it's not the same as actually having a native language speaker with real experiences in that place or that locale, and then surfacing that in a way that's actually like meaningful with them. And I think that's where there's this disconnect, isn't it? So it's that like kind of knowledge versus wisdom, right? That they're able to a degree, give you like some knowledge, like turning that into wisdom. That's only really possible with someone that's actually like living and breathing in that place. And I think that's like a real challenge at the moment.
Indeed, I mean, this is usually also a management challenge when you or myself too have to work with international SEO, because even if people usually associate international SEO only to Hreflang, I think that the most complicated thing in international SEO is a good localization, not just of the content, but maybe even less common things like localizing the navigation, localizing the menus in terms of organizing differently how the menus have been crafted or the navigation has been developed. And usually is the most complicated thing. And I totally agree when we usually say that, this version for, let's say, the American English, or let's say the Spanish one for Spain, should be done by someone native, because he can know the nature of the culture, not only the language as a grammatic. Both when you were working in agency, and maybe even now as a consultant, if you are dealing with international SEO, with businesses doing international SEO, how can you usually make them understand the importance of a good localization? And so the importance of relying also in terms of management with people that really knows the language that must be used for the localization.
I'd say for me, like the starting point is all businesses being different. But the starting point I'd say is probably having a look at how, say, a particular client or organization is structured, right? Because everyone's being different there. So I tend to look at it. There's normally some form of horizontal and vertical segmentation going on there. So you have like the language, the location, the business unit. And then on top of that, you've got this sort of localization layer. And I think if you start by sort of understanding that, that really helps you sort of mentally. What I'm trying to do is fit together like a mind map or an organization chart of how that organization fits together, and how everything sort of basically the relationships between each of those things. The trap that I see a lot of people fall into is with like the just international SEO as a holistic sort of term, is you end up sort of in this position where you're trying to boil the ocean, right? Where you try to like bring all these individual markets up by this, and then I would frame it differently by looking at, as I said, like get a real understanding of how organizationally that business is structured, and then align that with like other information such as, like basic things like the population of a country or like the audience or the size of the market in that territory. But that then allows you really to then start getting an idea of what initiatives are actually going to move the needle and what the size of the opportunity is. I wouldn't want to just be like as SEOs, like we're really good technical specialists. We have to be, but the the drawback of that is we're overactive in that skill. So what we do is we lead with the solution. So the point being there is as an SEO, you come in and go, oh my God, gold mine. It's an international site. There's no Hreflang. So you're it's like the kid at school, like when you're primary school, you come that to answer the question. You're like, I know. It's Hreflang. And actually, I would frame it differently that you still have to go in and actually spend time to look at situations that I call it situation analysis, but it is again, it's understanding the structure of the company, the market, and other broader economics, right? Like, Britain, in a different economic zone than maybe, the rest of the EU. We've got very different push-pull levers that economically, and that's different again within different parts of the EU. So knowing all of these things and how it fits together and their relationship, that for me is fundamental to actually then being a good consultant rather than just sort of going, Hreflang,
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And in fact, just as an anecdote, I teach for an SEO master here in Spain, actually a good one. I am in charge of the International SEO classes. And the SEO I'm teaching to is that the first hour of the lesson is just the question you have to ask to your client for international SEO. And they are not just the classic question, what is the technical stack you're using for your website, all this kind of somehow reasonable question if you think SEO in technical terms. But many are, okay, how is organized your company? You have a central office and local office in the countries you are targeting, or you even have physical presence in Google Maps in the countries, for instance. So where the public can go and talk with you, or what is the legal, in terms of law, there is some difference between what you can legally do in your country and what can you legally do in the country you're targeting. This is classic in pharma, for instance, or even for e-commerce. If they are not doing drop shipping, but if they really have warehouses, how is the logistic of your company? You don't know how many times I have to really do some sort of Sudoku with the Hreflang in order to show the correct URL because the logistic was pretending to show some specific version of a website because of the logistic. Because if not, it was all lost conversion substantially because doing everything but in the wrong version. I think you really touched a very valid point. We need to make this question because knowing these things, we can work better also technically. And talking about technical SEO, I know that you have talked in the past about the technical depth of international SEO. I'm sure that many people listening to us are going to ask by themselves, hey, but what about the Hreflang? We know that it's a classic topic. But do you agree with me that Hreflang is not so complicated, but everything else surrounding the Hreflang makes it very complicated? Hreflang is relatively easy, but if your canonicalization rules are not fine, it's going to be a problem. If the use of a no index is random, at least, also a Hreflang is going to be complicated. If you just copy pasted the same content in the same language in different countries, the Hreflang probably is not going to work in any case. So do you agree that Hreflang, there is this myth of it's really complicated, but actually is by itself is not so complicated?
Yeah, I largely disagree. Like the analogy I would use is it's like an iceberg, right? The portion of the iceberg that we see, like the href tag on its own, is relatively easy to as a conceptually understand. But below the waterline, there is this huge colossal iceberg of all these other signals, systems that can cause havoc. So the difficulty is that conceptually it's easy to explain to, like, say, a non-technical stakeholder. There's this markup that we can add either to the page or for a sitemap. What the hard thing then is to say is the stakeholder's like, brilliant, like sounds like a sensible thing to do. What then maybe isn't always communicated is then there are all these other things that need to be in place. So it becomes then much more of a colossal thing, right? To set up well. So yeah, it becomes then again, my point there, we lead with the solution. Okay, we got the solution, but we actually haven't really understood the requirements fully in terms of actually what good looks like to setting that solution up appropriately. There's almost like a series of other things that need to be in place, or even like, let's bring it back to properly business logic that needs to be in place before you even attempt to then actually do the easy bit, which I think is to generate it. Like to a degree, I'm like being very simple. Let's say it's easy to generate. It's not, but like all the things you touched upon there, that requires like logic. Some of that is like really easy for us as like humans to say, oh yeah, don't include that page, include that page, include that folder, and so on and so forth. But actually to create a system that can compute that to generate the file or the annotations is very hard. And that requires skill. And that requires like, I think like a lot more understanding of what's going on, the type of understanding that you maybe just don't get through just reading the guidelines on their own, right? You read the guidelines, you think this is much more easier than it sounds. Whereas like, you know, we know from practical experience that there are all these other pitfalls. So yeah, I definitely agree. I think, yeah, the iceberg analogy is my way of sort of
And
trying to.
out of curiosity, maybe even without citing names, but what was the most complicated in terms of this game of logic that we must do technically when it comes to international SEO in the technical side of international SEO? What was the most challenging experience you had?
I think I had a client, how do I put it? Like the boiled ocean analogy.
Mm-hmm.
So the challenge there was more, it becomes when the relationship gets out of kilter, right? Where the client comes to you as the consultant or the agency and suggests like, we want to do this thing. And you kind of know already that you maybe haven't pushed that thing because you know there's obvious flaws with it. And you kind of know that in this example, architecturally, this is where you've got, when I say boil the ocean, you've got separate sites for each CCTLD. So you're like managing a lot of sites, and none of those sites have any way of talking to each other. So that's where it becomes a real challenge. There is, how can you create a single thing that can easily check all those things you need to check before it generates the annotation or the sitemap, and that for me is probably like the
Yeah, yes.
tricky
How,
thing there.
how to do the matching between the different website, because yeah, sometimes it can be very complicated.
That's very sort of like in the olden days that they were like the real hard ones. Like, how do you do that? How do you surface the pages when the platform's like, basically there's problems with the underlying data structure on
Hmm.
each site. And it's like searching, like surfacing the equivalent page on each territory, location, you know, doing it maybe 1 to 3 is fine, but doing it on like
Yes.
30 countries is a challenge, right? And then it's like, is the effort versus reward?
Yeah, yes. In my case, it was a very funny case study because it wasn't neither a very big website. The problem was that his client literally decided, and that's why, because it wasn't working, that's why then he contacted me. He literally decided to target almost every country in the world. So he had a profusion of dozens of websites and not following only one architecture for international SEO. Some were in subdomains, some were in subfolder, some were in CCTLDs. And then he was targeting with the Hreflang annotation even countries where there is no reason to use a Hreflang, like this some sort of abandoned island in the middle of the ocean Arctic with only 30 people living there. There was an Hreflang for that.
Yeah.
That.
Well, you see that with Shopify, right?
Oh yes.
Because like Shopify is like, I think victim of its own success there, because it's really easy just to toggle stuff on, and you really, I think you have to have that underlying sense of geography, right? But like Shopify, there's always the one where it's like, well, like in Britain, you have like, we're delivering to Highlands and Islands, right? Which is like the Outer Hebrides, Orkney, Shetlands. And it's like, do you really want to be shipping your thing there? Maybe if it's like a big thing, or the classic is like the Marshall Islands, Guam, various US overseas military installations. There's check boxes for all these fun places, Vatican City, the list goes on. So what you have on like that ecosystem is you get people that, oh, we've developed a plugin that does this. It just like, it's a for loop that just runs through those territories where the box is ticked. And it's very easy to just create stuff. And what I find is, my favorite phrase is, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, it's very hard to get it back in, especially on a platform like that where there's not much redirection logic going on. So,
and maybe that's why also a Googler like Joe Mueller already a few years ago said that for him, the international SEO was, of all the verticals of SEO, the most complicated and complex of all the others. We respect all the others because of many things that must be considered when you are doing international SEO. But so somehow one could say that specializing in international SEO is a sort of sadomasochistic pleasure. But I think it's one of the most fascinating verticals of SEO. It's not going to bore you anywhere, anytime. What do you like really as a practitioner of international SEO with respect maybe other verticals of SEO?
I think this comes back to like, I like geography, and specifically like as a kid, I used to like things like stamp collecting, or like learning like flags, capital cities, things like stamp collecting, things like that. I always like had a passion for that. And those people that know me know I like really like maps. I have like a gift, I suppose, for like remembering places, like thinking like visually like that. So for me, there's like this natural appeal because it just suits this thing that I like about how the world fits together, and how, like you're in Google Maps, you can go up, you can go down. There's different ways that you can segment geographic data. And I've always found like, even like those maps, like if you go on like Reddit, there's subreddits for that, where you can look at all these fun maps, right? Like, I think there's like a fun map of like somewhere like Poland, isn't it? Where you can see like what parts of Poland vote for which political party and how that aligns with things from the past, right? That for me is like just something I've always been fascinated by. I have that natural interest. So being able to like work with, I guess, international clients, it allows me to sort of indulge in that interest and a curiosity. You get to find out more about different places, different people as well, which is fun. But yeah, it's for me like really good because I just love how it all fits together, right?
Yeah. And this is somehow the same reason. I mean, as an Italian, as I was telling to you before, international SEO and SEO was almost a synonym, because if you are not working only with Italian companies that are targeting just Italy, all companies in Italy, all business company targets at least have one English version because of the international market of it. But for me, about that sort of synonymity, also similar interest. And I think that international SEO is also the one a kind of vertical that surprise you all the time. I remember many years ago working with chess.com when chess.com still wasn't so famous as it is now and became quite a few years ago. I remember looking at their analytics, and we were always saying a not random number of clicks from Antarctica. We say, why? I mean, it's weird because it wasn't just, the classic 2-5 clicks per month or for 6 months. It was a constant big number of clicks. And so that make us understand that apart from a scientist that are obliged to stay in Antarctica, and Antarctica can be very boring, especially during the winter. So probably they go and play chess. We discovered that there were two permanent little towns in Antarctica. One is from Chile and one is Argentinian. And so this was a fantastic way of discovering things through simple analysis of international traffic that led chess.com to start creating a campaign talking about these people and obviously in relation with chess. So this is the kind of things that makes me love international SEO. Then there are things like, okay, a terrific technical stack that is making me explode my mind in order to understand how to fix all the things in order to make the international SEO strategy work, which is fascinating, but not so fascinating. Sometimes can be very stressful. Talking about your experiences, your history. So you were working for so many years in an agency with important roles. Then you decided to move to an SEO consultant. What of those years working in an agency you brought to your work as a consultant?
Yeah. So I think the important thing to recognize here is I did 12 years in one agency, which is,
Oh,
I
it's
think
quite
probably,
a record considering
yeah.
the.
So I'm an outlier, right? I did 12 years. So it either indicates one of two things, that I'm either crazy or they actually thought I was like not too bad at what I did. Probably a mixture of both. But fortunately for me, yeah, I guess whilst everyone's route into freelancing or consultancy, I think is different. I was really lucky, right? I worked at a good agency. I had good clients. I think most importantly, I was shown what good looked like from day one. So it was very well run. There were lots of processes, and I learned the value of that. It's sort of, when you start in my first role, I guess like more of like an SEO exec role, where I'd probably say I wasn't work ready, let's call it that. I really didn't know anything in those days, but because of that rigor that was around me, that allowed me to get experience at the right pace for me and develop. And I was fortunate enough then to sort of, I guess, carve out a role within the company doing that. So by the time that I left as a member of, like, say, the senior leadership team, I had a good grounding in things like process, new business. So kind of all the skills you kind of need, not all the skills, that I had a good head start in some of the skills that I'm going to need as a freelancer that aren't necessarily SEO centric, so good at like running key accounts, new business, understanding of processes, legal stuff, all these sort of essential non-essentials you need when you get into the work of the world of being a freelancer working on your own. I was really fortunate to have had get that under my belt in an agency environment. So that definitely helped me transition into being a freelance. And probably the other thing I didn't realize was I was worried about like the size of my network, right? When I was freelance, I was like, well, God, don't know anyone. I didn't really take into account was that I actually knew loads of people. So through that 12 years of just different colleagues, different client contacts, and it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought. So very fortunate, I think, just to have that 12-year stint. Again, it's not for everyone, but it has allowed me, I think, I'm now 5 years into being a freelancer consultant, that it's allowed me, I think, to make that transition. Like,
You choose the right moment to go freelance when COVID is exploded or not? Or I'm counting
yeah,
middle.
happy accident, right? So yeah, my last day was just before Christmas, and then I had like about a month off, like pretending that I'm like working when I'm not, you know, going to co-working spaces and like tapping a keyboard. But yeah, I pretty much registered business, I think like 10 days before we went into lockdown. So I had this 6-month period of basically not having much work, but I also had time to really like that 6 months. I focused really hard on processes and building like, I do a lot of Python programming. This is before the LLM revolution. So I spend a lot of time, you know, on Stack Overflow, just getting better at programming and building things. So that 6 months is really helpful because I think if I went straight into it, it would have maybe not had as much time to like set things up. By the time I started to win clients around September, I had certain things in place. So it really helped me that respect. So on this one hand, financially maybe wasn't great. On the other side of things, I had this like window of opportunity to just like really accelerate my learning with like the system side of things, which I really enjoyed. So yeah, it kind of worked out for me by
Mhm.
accident. So I just, yeah.
And you were saying you took this time also to put your head even more into creating assets, for instance, with Python and so on. And you were just thinking that before the LLM, now that we have the LLMs, let's say that we have things like Claude, Code, Codex, all these things that are vibe coding, etc., etc. How was your transition, let's call it so, from a more classic developing for creating your own tools, your own framework of tools for better analysis and technical analysis, to using AI for improving or creating even more tools? And maybe the most important question should be this: when you know that you really need something like this, and how much do you, instead, when you know that, okay, this is something that I can do, let's say with a machine, but maybe it's better that I still do it in the old way.
I think for like background context, when it started off, right, a lot of my analysis was in Excel, right? And you get to the point when you're working with Excel where things start to break, right? Especially like when you're working on, like you said, like larger international clients where you start having to worry about the number of rows and stuff like that, or the time it takes for formula update and things like that. So I kind of went through this process of I'm doing things in Excel, I'm starting to break Excel, and then I've got me into problems of like, oh, I'm using GA. This is Universal Analytics, right? Where you can get 5,000 rows out in the old days in one export. But okay, I'm working on this site and I've got 120,000 landing pages. How do I get them out? So you come into this, like, you hit this problem with scale, right? So you kind of start that with Excel. And then this is in the era when I was like learning a lot from like people like Richard Baxter, Mike King. They like this stuff that they shared, like really helped me like accelerate in that my Excel skills. And you kind of just keep going. And there's like a thing that you learn, like, okay, there's this like add-on or there's an API connector, like I've forgotten the name, but there's like API connectors for like Excel. And then you're like, okay, and you find out about APIs. And at Equimedia, we had like a development team, and one of the developers there, he helped me build like my first scraper, and it kind of just went there. So then once I kind of picked up Python, it kind of just felt natural because I kind of had a good understanding of like the problem space, and then it kind of just clicked overnight then in terms of like, I need to do this. And like if I just use GA as an example now, even with GA4, I need to do a batch request for these 7 dimensions, these 5 metrics. I need to loop through that for each 5,000 rows of data. And I've got to append them on the end. I do that for day 1, then I do it for day 2, then I do it for day 3 until I tell it to stop. And then I get my 1 million rows and I'm going to load it then into, by then I'm like, wow, there's this thing called pandas that can comfortably handle millions of rows of data. And I'm like, wow, Panda, this is amazing. This is brilliant. Like, and again, I'm like already thinking in steps because of like that Excel stuff. And then it's like, okay, getting really good at pandas now. And then you're like, whoa, there's GA4 comes along and there's a BigQuery connector. And you're like, whoa, I've got the raw data. And now I can write a query to get it all and do all the transformations inside that. So it's just sort of building on that foundation. So for me, it was, through Excel, picking up Python to do some basic stuff, doing API work, putting that stuff into pandas, and now sort of I'm moving on to BigQuery and now creating like workflows with that. So it's been really fun learning and acquiring all that. But to probably answer your question is, there is some tasks that maybe aren't suitable for that. So a lot of my stuff is database, like using GA4, Search Console data. Certain things maybe quicker just using good old fashioned things, like classifications, right? Certain classifications, probably LLMs, maybe not as good at. So like those are sort of examples there where it's like interpretation. You have to, I think, have a bit more understanding of like how machines classify to solve those sort of problems. But for me, it's sort of like that systems-based signal. It's that top-down design, right? Start with the goal, look at each step in the process, look at, does that need human intervention? And then probably then on top of that, there's like quality control, quality assurance of each step, right? So you're actually checking the outputs, because definitely had like failures. I guess that's more where you're asking things like AI to interpret something. Classifications is like a good one there, where at face value it looks good, but it doesn't necessarily pass the sniff test, if you know what I mean. When you actually look at it and you think,
yes, it's something that I see also when I use for things like, keyword grouping in the sense of following a taxonomy or an ontology, I found a way to make it work, but you need a lot of pre-kitchen on the data that you're going to give to. This is something that usually, I don't want to say for ignorance, maybe because between brackets, let's call it ingenuity, many people misunderstand and they just push the data as they have it extracted by their own tools and give it to an LLM to interpret it, which can be a road to disaster, because that data should be pre-cooked before in order for the LLM to really understand what you want to achieve with their app. Sometimes this part is missing, and there usually where I have to review things done by in-house SEO is where sometimes I can find now the original scene of a incorrect strategy, for instance.
Yeah. Most of my stuff involves like some form of closed classification, where the initial step for me is actually like looking at what the underlying data structure is, the frequency of maybe each token that I'm looking to classify, and looking at the entities to give me a feel of what the data looks like, and then creating a closed set of classifications that I want to use. Or I just do straight up like entity extraction, which I find is more easier just to extract. And that can be more simple as just like something like Python, like using list comprehension.
Yes.
So like one of the most common ones there I use that for is geographic data. So like Search Console data, I use an API there, pull out a list of like known locations for that country or that locale, and then use list comprehension then to match them. And that's then how I basically widen my Search Console data, like geographically.
That's interesting.
Which is, you can tell I quite enjoy that. But you have to understand the structure. So I think like in that example there, it's like, I use the UK as an example, right? We have counties, towns.
Oh yes,
Cities,
you are so
all this
complicated
fun stuff. And then for most of the Google stuff, you can download all their geographic stuff, a massive file. So it has all their stuff. So I just have lists on my computer of all these geographical things ready for matching.
Let's talk about just as a last question about the LLMs, and you're a really strong technical SEO. And usually when people talks about optimizing website for visibility in ChatGPT, LLMs like this, usually people obviously talks of content, how to structure the content, or we should talk about semantics and so on. But only from time to time we hear about the technical side of the optimization for LLMs. As a strong technical SEO yourself, what would you suggest people, other SEO, listening to us, pay attention to when it comes to technical SEO for AI search?
I think for me, it requires change equals disruption, and change is constant. We're going through a lot of disruption, which at the same time is an opportunity. So I think for me, my interpretation of how to leverage that is it requires a deeper like embedding within a client's business. So for me, that is being maybe on site more where possible, or the running and facilitation of workshops. Because what I want to do is going back is to really understand that client or organization in as much detail as possible. So for me, the starting point with LLMs now is you have to understand positioning and why. Because I do an exercise where for my client, we want to understand like what attributes they want to be known for, what's the value of those attributes, and who cares about them. And actually, if you sit down with a client and ask them to fill in that, or you run a workshop to do that, you get some interesting outputs, right? Because this is their view of the world. This is maybe your audience's view of the world. Are they the same? So from that sort of exercise, we can then start comparing yourself to competitors. You get an idea of what makes you unique. Where are you better than others? What aspects are the same? And maybe where you want to be improved. And I'm thinking here just about attributes like we're seen as good value, or we're seen as trustworthy, or we're really good at fulfillment, all these different things, right? But now as SEOs, I think we really have to understand that, because it's not as simple as just sort of saying, put it on the page and hopefully the LLM will extract it. So we have to start with that to understand what attributes we want to be known for and what entities. So entities there, just simple English, that translates to a noun, right? Attributes, generally adjectives, descriptive, right? And that then helps you translate that into, well, is the content actually exists? Is it written in such a way that is easily extractable? Can the LLM system access that? No, that might not actually be that significantly different maybe than just writing historically would have written semantic HTML, right? But actually, I think the difference here is actually, because SEOs, we love to like wing it, is actually spending the time to actually, these are the attributes, or these are our clients' attributes and the value of those attributes. That's what we want to be known for. And this is our audience that we're targeting. And it's not, we're just targeting women between 18 and 24, because that's like the GA audience bucket.
Yes,
Actually,
yes. The
that first
classic, the old style HubSpot persona.
Actually do look at your first party, hopefully you do have some first party data, but actually look at that data. But there's this whole thing about, so my point is that it requires much deeper and thorough understanding. So that's where change equals disruption. That's an opportunity cost, because like to do those sort of exercises, it takes time, it takes money. So it's either do you take the hit on that, or is the client prepared to see the value in that? But for me, that's the starting point now. Maybe it should have been the starting point, but the point is you can't just go in and just sort of like willy-nilly just put stuff on the page.
Oh, yes, obviously. And I think that in the really beginning of our conversation, we were saying, when we were talking and joking about the self-titled us SEO, sometimes we invent for ourselves. You were saying, oh, I'm a technical marketer. Actually, this is a good, what you have just said is a good definition of technical marketer. So someone who is doing marketing question,
Yeah.
for then adapting it with the technicalities of our work.
Yeah. I've seen some sort of thought leadership recently where you probably heard of like having a T-shaped skill set.
Oh, yes.
And there's this sort of new concept now that actually maybe we're shifting in an AI era to having like an M-shaped skill set.
Well, I remember that in the time I was using the P in the classic, the Greek P, the number P, and the P version of the T shape, because P was on one side is the technical stuff, on the other side is the marketing specialization. So a general know about the digital and the marketing, but then focusing on one specific vertical and one other specific vertical communicating with them. I think VM is substantially the same, no?
Yeah. I think you're right there. I think the reality is that in order to be like AI ready in 2026, we're having to evolve our skill sets, our heuristics almost. I think the one conversation that keeps popping up to me with like, I guess it sounds corny, like with business leaders, even though it's important, right? They know it's like a huge opportunity. Like what they don't know is like how to integrate it within their company, their organization. They can see that. And what I find interesting is like chatting as like an SEO, just to like other people that work in other companies, is like they're fascinated to find like the stuff that we're doing, like because like I think we are at the cutting edge there in terms of like early adoption and a lot of these things that other companies just aren't doing. And I think that's an example of us, like we're in this like filter bubble, like just the world of SEOs. And actually, if you look at the wider workplace, I think there's a lot we can offer there as well. Not just maybe just SEO skill sets, but actually just like how to some of this process and innovation management. I think we're in a good position as an industry because obviously we've had to adopt fast and we've had to adopt early.
Yes, I think we have the experience of being declared dead so many times and so many times resuscitated from the grave. So we are used to change, and we are used to change faster. This is maybe the advantage of SEO with respect to maybe other, let's call it digital marketing figures or profession. So let's stop talking about SEO. But I have a question for you. Since you were telling me that when you were younger, you were always fascinated by geography and you have this passion for maps. So, two questions. Imagine that you are opening a map of Earth right now. What is the first country you usually look at instinctively? Maybe that places that you always dream about, visit, or to know more things about.
Yeah, so I like to like discover, like find, like I'm inquisitive, right? So sometimes I look for like a cue to do the search, right? So sometimes I might just go on like the front page of Wikipedia because there's always like an article about a place
Hmm.
that I haven't heard about. So I go there. I mean, this is crazy. Sometimes I will literally go on Google Maps and go to the start of the River Danube. And I'll try and follow the Danube on Google Maps all the way to source. And along the way, you kind of find some interesting places. And then I maybe start looking them up on Wikipedia. So I have maybe done that on quite a few large rivers in my time. So I try to like play these little games. But I mean, it can be as simple as like when you meet someone else in the industry and you kind of find out a bit. I'm always curious to find out like who people are from so I can like try and look it up on the map, like not in like a weirdo sort of way, but
Oh,
just generally find out more about that place. So for me, that's more just like, I think it's really interesting just to find out more about your peers, like where they're from. You find out more about their culture, and I generally find that really interesting.
yeah,
So
yes, I feel the same. But now that I know that you're really this big passion about maps. This is for you that are listening to us. You have to know that Jonathan and I shared very recently in a group, private group, a map of Rome, what things to see in Rome. And I was sure that also because I lived in Rome 9 years and to have put the most interesting thing. Then came Jonathan with his own map. It was crazy. It was always being for things. And I was joking with you. I say, you even put a barber shop. So
that's a good
but
barbershop.
stand better why your map was so perfect.
Yeah. So I'm going to try and like maybe try and do a talk on this, but it's the concept of spotting things, collecting, and then basically categorizing them and then sharing them. So what I like about maps or like curating maps,
Mhm.
like basically like the pins, that's like my thing, right? Is I get my ideas from lots of places. It could be like just reading something online, or I really get a lot of things from it. Places like Instagram, right?
Hmm.
I can tell you exactly why I saved that barbershop. So this is like how my brain works. I can remember like random things. And there's like about 100 and over 100 things on that roadmap. But yeah, it's like a cool barbershop. I think like you can get like cocktails in there or something. I think that's why I saved it. You can get like a good Negroni in there, I think. So yeah, so there's like these things I see, and then like, I don't know how I can still remember it, but I just build up this like mental picture of like Rome in my head, and then all the places and how it all fits together. And then I don't know, I'm like, yeah, and then I like buy a book on Rome and then save things from there. So actually
Yeah.
got a book on Rome at the moment, actually, that I'm reading. So
Okay,
it's a bit more
Jonathan.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's interesting how these kind of things make you understand better how a person is, and somehow this attention you have, this love for classifying things, for categorizing things, for defining things. We also see it during our conversation in the way you work. Substantially, it's not so different. Your mental framework is the same substantially for these things, and you're working as an international SEO and technical SEO. Jonathan, thank you very much. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being my guest
Been a lot
today.
of fun.
Yeah. And let's hope to see you soon
Yeah. Fingers
in,
crossed.
in the future in real life again. And maybe in the next episode of a series session. Thank you.
Been a pleasure.
And thanks to all of you. And remember, let me do the YouTuber style thing. Subscribe to the channel and ring up the bell to be notified for new episode of a series session. Thank you and bye-bye.